Every step you took today, forward, backward, upstairs, down again, operated in one plane, the sagittal plane, forward and backward. Even backwards walking, which reverses the direction and loads the quadriceps and the cerebellum differently, stays in that same plane. The plane your body has not entered, possibly in weeks, possibly in months, is the frontal plane, side to side, and the muscle that controls it. The gluteus medius, sitting on the outer surface of the pelvis beneath the larger gluteus maximus, is the single strongest biomechanical predictor of hip fracture in adults over 65. That muscle fires when the body moves laterally. It stabilizes the pelvis when one foot leaves the ground. And it has been receiving near zero activation from every step, every stair, every treadmill session in your life, because none of those movements ask the body to step sideways. The gait pattern produced by its weakness has a clinical name, Trendelenburg, Gait, and it is visible from across a room. How a single muscle's weakness connects to a hip fracture begins with the physics of planes. Your body is engineered to move in three independent planes of motion. The sagittal plane divides the body into left and right halves. Every forward or backward movement operates here. Walking, running, cycling, climbing stairs, sitting down and standing up. The frontal plane divides the body into front and back halves. Every lateral movement operates here. Sidestepping, cartwheels, the defensive shuffle of a basketball player cutting laterally across the court. The transverse plane divides the body into upper and lower halves. Every rotational movement operates here. Twisting to throw a ball, turning to look over your shoulder, swinging a golf club through its arc. As a child, you used all three planes constantly, running sideways across a playground, spinning until the world blurred, dodging a thrown ball by leaping laterally, cartwheeling across wet grass. Tag required it. The person chasing you did not run in a straight line, and neither did you. Every game demanded movement in directions that no adult exercise program replicates, and the muscles that control each plane received high-intensity activation with every chase, every scramble, every lateral leap over a puddle. Modern adult life is almost entirely sagittal. Consider a typical day from the moment you wake. Walk to the kitchen, the car, the office, sagittal. Climb stairs, sagittal. Walk on a treadmill, ride a bicycle, run along a path, all sagittal. Every exercise recommended for cardiovascular health, every step prescribed for bone density, every minute logged on a fitness tracker operates exclusively in the forward-backward plane. The frontal plane receives almost no input throughout an entire day, not reduced input, near zero. Even the exercises that feel different, an elliptical trainer, a rowing machine, a cycling class, are sagittal. The foot goes forward and back. The knee flexes and extends. The hip moves through flexion and extension. Side to side does not occur. The muscles that control sagittal movement, quadriceps, hamstrings, calves, receive thousands of activation cycles daily from walking alone. The muscle that controls frontal plane pelvic stability receives meaningful activation only when the body moves laterally, and your body stopped moving laterally decades ago. What this elimination costs becomes clear when you look at what happens inside the pelvis during every single step you take. Each step of forward walking includes a single leg stance phase, the fraction of a second when one foot bears the full load and the other swings forward through the air. During that phase, something specific happens to the pelvis that most people have never considered. The entire weight of the body above the hip joint, your torso, your arms, your head, the swinging leg, applies a downward rotational force on the unsupported side. Gravity pulls the swing side of the pelvis downward with a force equal to roughly 2/3 of your body weight, acting at a lever arm of approximately 15 to 20 centimeters from the hip joint center. That is a substantial rotational force, the equivalent of hanging a 45-kilogram weight off one side of the pelvis every time you take a step. Only one structure prevents the pelvis from dropping, the gluteus medius on the stance side, contracting from the outer surface of the ilium to pull upward on the greater trochanter of the femur. But the gluteus medius operates at a severe mechanical disadvantage. Its lever arm, the perpendicular distance from the hip joint center to its line of pull on the trochanter, is only 5 to 7 centimeters. Roughly 1/3 the lever arm of the gravitational load. The torque equation is unforgiving. To balance 2/3 of body weight acting at 3 times its own lever arm, the gluteus medius must generate a force approximately equal to the entire body weight, just to keep the pelvis level during every step. For a 70-kilogram person, that means the gluteus medius produces roughly 700 newtons of force during every single leg stance phase, with every step thousands of times per day, year after year. When the muscle is strong, the pelvis stays level and the gait appears smooth, the mechanical work invisible. When the muscle has weakened from years of frontal plane disuse, the pelvis drops on the swing. Side, 2, 3, 4 degrees of sag with each step. That sag is Trendelenburg gait, and Trendelenburg gait cascades consequences through every joint below the pelvis. 2 degrees of pelvic drop shifts the body's center of mass laterally over the stance foot, increasing the lateral force vector through the hip joint with each step. The hip receives asymmetric loading concentrated on the superior lateral rim of the acetabulum, the cartilage region where osteoarthritis most commonly initiates. The knee experiences valgus stress, the inward collapse pattern that accelerates medial compartment wear. The ankle compensates with pronation. A torque deficit at the pelvis, from a muscle most people have never heard of, radiates mechanical consequences down through the hip, the knee, and the foot with every step of every day. Trendelenburg gait produces a characteristic pelvic waddle, a torque failure visible from 20 meters away that reveals the precise muscle failing to produce the force the pelvis requires. Forward walking activates the gluteus medius at only 15 to 20% of its maximum voluntary contraction, as DeStefano and colleagues measured in a 2009 study published in the Journal of Orthopedic and Sports Physical Therapy, enough to prevent gross pelvic collapse during normal gait, insufficient to maintain the muscle strength and mass across decades of aging. Lateral stepping, by contrast, activates the gluteus medius at 40 to 60% of maximum, 2 to 3 times the activation. The muscle that forward walking barely stimulates is the muscle that a single lateral step loads at training intensity, 700 newtons every time the foot lifts off the ground. Every person who has noticed a slight lateral waddle in an older relative's walk, a hip dropping with each step, the shoulders compensating with a sideways lean toward the stance leg, has been watching a gluteus medius that can no longer produce the counter torque the pelvis demands. The torque equation has not changed with age. The muscle producing the answer has weakened. Most people assume falls happen forward, tripping over an obstacle, the foot catching on a curb, the body pitching toward the ground. The biomechanical data shows a different pattern. The majority of hip fractures in adults over 65 result from lateral falls, falling to the side, directly onto the greater trochanter of the femur. A forward fall distributes impact energy across the outstretched hands and forearms. The body's instinctive bracing response absorbs much of the kinetic energy before it reaches the hip. A lateral fall delivers the full ground reaction force to the greater trochanter, the bony prominence on the outer femur, with no intervening structure to absorb the load. The impact force during a lateral fall from standing height can exceed 10 times body weight in the milliseconds of ground contact. For a 70-kilogram person, that means forces exceeding 7,000 newtons striking a bony surface with a contact area smaller than a tennis ball. That force arrives in 15 to 20 milliseconds, too fast for any muscular bracing response to intervene. Impact mechanics compound the problem. During a forward fall, the body's center of mass decelerates over a long path as the arms extend, the knees bend, and the torso rotates toward the ground, spreading the deceleration across time and reducing the peak force. During a lateral fall, the hip strikes the ground with almost no deceleration path. The body drops sideways, the greater trochanter contacts the surface, and the full kinetic energy of the fall converts to force in the instant of impact. Short deceleration time produces high peak force. High peak force on a small contact area produces fracture. Mediolateral balance, the ability to control side-to-side sway, degrades faster than antero-posterior balance with age. Mediolateral sway increased disproportionately after 60, and mediolateral instability proved a stronger predictor of future falls than forward-backward instability. As Hilliard and colleagues documented in Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation in 2008, the divergence follows directly from the activation asymmetry. The muscles that control forward-backward balance receive continuous daily stimulus from sagittal movement, while the muscles that control side-to-side balance receive almost none. The result is a balance system that degrades unevenly, strong in the direction the body moves every day, weakening in the direction it no longer moves at all. A person who walks 30 minutes daily has strong sagittal plane balance and progressively weakening frontal plane balance, a growing gap between the plane they train and the plane they fall in. Hip fracture in adults over 65 carries a 1-year mortality rate of 20 to 30%, as Magaziner and colleagues established in the Journal of Gerontology in 2000. 1 in 5 adults who fracture a hip will die within 12 months, from pulmonary embolism, hospital-acquired pneumonia, the rapid deconditioning that enforced bed rest produces, the immune suppression of sustained immobility. Among those who survive, fewer than half recover their pre-fracture level of mobility. The fracture often ends independence permanently. The fracture is the entry event. The mortality and the disability that follow it are the consequence. And the strongest single predictor of whether the entry event occurs is the strength of a muscle that modern life barely activates. Gluteus medius strength, measured as hip abduction force on a dynamometer, predicts the entry event with a precision that surprised the researchers who first documented the correlation. A strong gluteus medius maintains the medial-lateral balance that keeps the body upright when it sways laterally, catching the lateral perturbation before the center of mass crosses the base of support. A weak gluteus medius allows the lateral sway to cross that threshold. The moment when the body's momentum exceeds the muscle's ability to generate corrective force and the fall begins. The muscle does not cushion the impact. It prevents the fall from happening. The difference between a lateral sway that self-corrects and one that becomes a fall is measured in newtons of abduction force at the hip, force that the gluteus medius either can produce or cannot, depending on how many decades it has been receiving meaningful activation. A 20-year-old with an active gluteus medius generates enough corrective force to recover from lateral perturbations that would floor an 80-year-old whose gluteus medius has atrophied from 60 years of exclusively sagittal movement. The physics is the same. The muscle's capacity to meet the physics has changed. Testing my own medial-lateral sway on a clinical force plate, standing on one leg with eyes closed while the plate recorded center of pressure displacement, produced a result I was not expecting. My lateral sway measured 60% wider than my anterior-posterior sway, 60%. My sagittal balance, maintained by decades of walking and running, fell well within the normal range for my age. My frontal balance, maintained by nothing in my daily movement pattern, had degraded without producing a single symptom. The frontal plane deficit was invisible until a force plate quantified it. You now know what the missing plane controls: pelvic torque, lateral balance, fall direction, fracture prediction, and why the muscle that stabilizes it has been receiving near zero activation from decades of sagittal plane life. The question changes from what the body lost to why 60 seconds of lateral stepping produces more gluteus medius activation than 30 minutes of forward walking. The physics of that difference involves the most efficient mechanical trick the human body uses, and its complete absence in the frontal plane. Forward walking is one of the most energy-efficient locomotor patterns in nature, and the efficiency comes from physics, not from muscular effort. During forward gait, the body uses inverted pendulum mechanics. The center of mass vaults over the stance leg with each step, rising as it passes over the foot and falling as it moves ahead, exchanging potential energy for kinetic energy and back again in a continuous gravitational cycle. Up to 65% of the mechanical energy from one step is recovered passively in the next, through this gravitational exchange, as Inman described in his landmark analysis of human locomotion. The muscles contribute only the remaining 35%, providing push-off force and directional control while the pendulum does the rest. Watch a person walking towards you on a pavement. Their head bobs slightly up and down with each step, rising as the body vaults over the stance leg, falling as the center of mass drops ahead. That bob is the pendulum. It is the mechanical reason walking costs so little metabolic energy relative to the distance covered. The body uses gravity during forward walking, catching the falling mass with the next step and converting the downward energy into forward motion. The exchange is so efficient that humans can walk for hours before fatigue limits them. No other locomotor pattern achieves this efficiency. Running costs roughly twice the energy per kilometer because it adds a flight phase that breaks the pendular cycle. Forward walking is uniquely subsidized by gravity because the body's mass rises and falls in synchrony with the stepping rhythm, and the pendulum captures that oscillation as free mechanical work. This is why forward walking feels easy. Your muscles are performing roughly 1/3 of the mechanical work. Gravity and momentum, cycling through the inverted pendulum, perform the other two-thirds. Lateral stepping has no pendulum. The center of mass does not vault over the stance leg in an arc. Because gravity pulls straight down and lateral movement is perpendicular to that pull, the gravitational exchange that makes forward walking efficient cannot form. The pendulum requires the center of mass to rise and fall along the direction of travel. In forward walking, it does. The body rises over the stance leg and falls forward into the next step. In lateral stepping, the direction of travel is horizontal while gravity is vertical. The oscillation that the pendulum captures does not exist. The center of mass must be actively pushed sideways against gravity, decelerated over the new stance foot, stabilized against lateral overshoot, and pushed sideways again. There is no gravitational exchange between potential and kinetic energy. There is no momentum recovery from the previous step. Every lateral step requires 100% active muscular force production from initiation through completion. Well, this explains a sensation that anyone who tries lateral stepping immediately notices. 60 seconds of lateral stepping at a moderate pace feels dramatically harder than 60 seconds of forward walking at the same pace. The distance covered is similar. The speed is similar. The perceived effort is vastly different, and the reason is purely mechanical. Forward walking receives a 65% energy subsidy from pendular physics. Lateral stepping receives none. Every newton of lateral force must be generated by muscle, sustained by muscle, and decelerated by muscle. The gluteus medius, the hip adductors, the quadratus lumborum, and the lateral ankle stabilizers are performing all of the mechanical work that forward walking shares with gravity. And then, the activation data confirmed the physics. Lateral stepping loaded the gluteus medius at training intensity from a movement that takes 60 seconds and requires nothing beyond the willingness to step to the side. Lateral stepping recruits more than the gluteus medius alone. It activates an entire kinetic chain that forward walking leaves dormant. A coordinated lateral response from hip to ankle that fires as a unit during every sideways step. When the body steps laterally, the gluteus medius abducts the leading hip, pulling the leg away from the midline to initiate the step. The tensor fasciae latae tensions the iliotibial band on the lateral side of the knee, stabilizing the joint against the valgus force that lateral weight transfer produces. The peroneal muscles, peroneus longus and brevis, evert the ankle on the landing foot, stabilizing the lateral border as it receives body weight from a direction it almost never encounters during sagittal movement. The quadratus lumborum on the stance side contracts to prevent lateral trunk flexion toward the stepping leg. The contralateral internal oblique fires to resist the lateral sway of the torso above the pelvis. 5 muscle groups from hip to ankle, firing as a coordinated frontal plane unit during every lateral step. Forward walking recruits none of them at training intensity. The lateral chain exists in your body fully intact. The muscles have received no activation signal because the movement that recruits them disappeared from daily life when sports ended, when dancing stopped, when nothing in the weekly routine required stepping in any direction except forward. And then, the first lateral step after weeks of absence reactivates the entire chain simultaneously. The gluteus medius fires at training intensity, the iliotibial band tensions, the peroneals brace the ankle, and the quadratus lumborum stabilizes the trunk. 5 muscle groups that had been receiving zero coordinated input suddenly fire as a unit, the frontal plane stabilization system returning to function in a single step. Step sideways in a hallway and you can feel it, the outer hip engaging in a way that forward walking never produces, the ankle stabilizing laterally against a force vector it rarely encounters, the trunk resisting a lateral sway that sagittal movement never creates. The sensation is immediate and unmistakable. The body recognizes the movement and the muscles respond as if the frontal plane has not been forgotten, only unfed. The response is so immediate because the motor pattern is encoded, functional, waiting. The only missing element was the mechanical signal to activate it. Within 5 steps, the hip burning tells you precisely which muscle has been understimulated. Within 10 steps, the lateral chain is working as a coordinated unit. Within 30 seconds, you understand, physically, viscerally, why forward walking never produced this sensation and never could. Sarcopenia, the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass, affects every muscle after 40. But the rate of atrophy follows a principle that converges with everything. The pelvis, the fall data, and the pendulum mechanics have revealed it is proportional to the level of disuse. Muscles that receive daily loading, the quadriceps from walking, the calves from standing, atrophy at the baseline sarcopenic rate of roughly 1 to 2% of mass per year after 50. Muscles that receive near zero loading atrophy faster because the mechanotransduction signal that triggers protein synthesis in the muscle fiber, the mechanical stimulus the muscle requires to maintain its mass, is absent. Without loading, the molecular pathway that rebuilds muscle protein after daily wear does not activate. And without that activation, the muscle degrades not from damage but from the simple absence of the signal that tells it to maintain itself. The rate differential between loaded and unloaded muscle is not small. Over a decade, the gluteus medius in a person who walks daily but never steps sideways can lose 2 to 3 times more mass than their quadriceps, both muscles aging, both losing mass to sarcopenia, but at rates determined entirely by how often each receives the mechanical loading that tells it to maintain itself. The gluteus medius, barely activated by forward walking while the movement that loads it at training intensity has been absent for decades, is losing mass at a rate the quadriceps, loaded thousands of times daily, never experiences. Hip abductor cross-sectional area on imaging was reduced by 25 to 40% in sedentary older adults compared to age-matched controls who maintained lateral movement activities, as Ranieri and colleagues confirmed in the Journal of the American Medical Directors Association in 2017. The activities that preserved the muscle shared one common feature. They required frontal plane movement, dancing, tennis, martial arts, activities that most adults abandoned decades before the imaging was performed. The reduction in gluteus medius mass was not uniform across the muscle. The posterior fibers, which contribute most to pelvic stability during single-leg stance, atrophied disproportionately because sagittal plane movement recruits them the least of any region within the muscle. Now, mediolateral balance testing reveals the consequence with precision that surprised the researchers who measured it. Adults over 60 who regularly engage in lateral movement activities have mediolateral sway measurements comparable to adults 15 years younger. 15 years of balance age erased by movements that take minutes per day. Their sagittal balance, forward and backward stability, is no better than their sedentary peers. Both groups walk forward with roughly equal control because both groups walk forward with roughly equal frequency. The advantage is entirely specific to the frontal plane, entirely specific to the muscles and neural pathways that only lateral movement activates. The lateral movement maintained the specific balance system that forward walking, backward walking, stair climbing, cycling, and every other sagittal movement cannot reach. Pelvic torque, fall direction, pendular energy mechanics, the lateral kinetic chain, the rate of sarcopenic atrophy, 5 independent physics systems, 5 different mechanisms, all converging on the same absent signal, frontal plane movement, the mechanical input that disappeared when adult life became exclusively sagittal. Each system degraded independently through its own physics, at its own rate, through its own mechanism, and none of them can be restored by increasing the volume or intensity of sagittal plane exercise, walking more, walking faster, walking backward. Only changing a plane of movement reaches the systems that have been starved of input, and each system's degradation increases the probability of a single outcome, a lateral fall onto the greater trochanter, the event that carries the mortality the magazine or data documented. When the body steps laterally for the first time in weeks, a full stride length to the side, not a shuffle, the leading foot landing under the body's center of mass, the gluteus medius fires at an intensity it has not experienced since the last time the body moved in the frontal plane. Within the first 3 steps, the activation reaches training intensity. By the 10th step, the gluteus medius on both the leading and trailing hips has received more activation than 30 minutes of forward walking would provide. The lateral chain engages as a coordinated unit from hip to ankle. The burning on the outer hip confirms the signal is arriving. The mechanotransduction input the muscle has been waiting for. 10 steps to the right, then 10 steps to the left, 60 seconds total. Both sides receive activation with every lateral step. Unlike forward walking, where only the stance side gluteus medius fires, and only at maintenance level. The movement is simple enough to perform in a hallway, a kitchen, a hotel room. The loading is substantial enough to cross the mechanotransduction threshold that separates muscle maintenance from muscle loss. After 2 weeks, adding a resistance band around the ankles increases the abduction force required for each step, loading the gluteus medius at an intensity sufficient for strength adaptation beyond the maintenance threshold that unresisted stepping provides. Anyone with a hip replacement, a history of hip fracture, or significant balance impairment should discuss frontal plane loading with their physiotherapist before introducing lateral stepping. The torque demands on the hip joint during lateral movement are substantial, and the joint must be stable enough to tolerate them. That gap between maintenance activation and training intensity is why I added 60 seconds of lateral stepping to each morning, not as exercise, as a signal. The specific mechanical input the frontal plane system requires to maintain the pelvic stability that determines whether a lateral fall happens. Forward, backward, upstairs, downstairs, every direction the body moved today loaded one plane. The muscles trained in that plane are strong. The balance calibrated to that plane is intact. The plane the body falls in is the plane it abandoned. The direction is sideways.